I'm Savannah, 30, female. I live with my husband, Ethan, in a cozy little house in the suburbs that we've slowly been turning into our own personal sanctuary. By day, I'm an e-commerce manager for a growing online fashion brand, a job that's all about data, details, and understanding what people want. It was a life of comfortable routines and quiet happiness, one I thought was built on a foundation of mutual trust and respect, especially with my husband's family. I couldn't have been more wrong. I thought I was attending a simple family dinner, but I walked into a meticulously planned ambush designed to destroy my marriage and my reputation. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Marrying Ethan was the easiest decision I'd ever made. He was kind, creative, and saw the world in vibrant color palettes and clean design lines, a perfect complement to my world of spreadsheets and conversion rates. Our life together was a comfortable rhythm of shared dreams and quiet evenings. The only discordant note in our otherwise perfect harmony was his family. Specifically, his mother, Carol, and his younger sister, Jessica. On the surface, everything was pleasant. Carol, a retired real estate agent who still carried the air of someone constantly closing a deal, was all saccharine smiles and perfectly timed compliments that always felt like they had a hidden clause. "Savannah, dear, that dress is lovely. So brave of you to wear such a bold print," she'd say, her eyes scanning me as if assessing a property's flaws. She was the matriarch, the sun around which her children were expected to orbit, and she made it subtly clear from day one that I was a foreign body in her solar system, a satellite she couldn't quite control. She wanted Ethan to marry someone from their town, someone she had vetted and approved, not a career-focused woman from the city. Jessica was her mother's echo, though her motivations seemed less about control and more about a simmering, inexplicable jealousy. A self-proclaimed lifestyle blogger, her life seemed to consist of artfully arranged brunches and Instagram posts with inspirational captions that stood in stark contrast to her real life listlessness. She was 28, but had the directionless angst of a teenager. While I was building a career and a life with her brother, Jessica was still living at home, her blogging career largely funded by her parents. Whenever I spoke about a success at work or a trip Ethan and I were planning, a shadow would pass over Jessica's face, quickly replaced by a bright, brittle smile. She'd offer a lukewarm, "That's amazing for you," that never quite reached her eyes. The whispers would always start when I left the room. I'd walk back from the restroom during family gatherings to find Carol and Jessica in a hushed, intense conversation, which would abruptly halt the moment they saw me, their faces snapping back into practiced neutrality. Ethan, ever the optimist, dismissed my concerns. "That's just how they are," he'd say with a shrug. "Mom's a bit overbearing and Jess is still figuring things out. They don't mean anything by it." He loved his family, and his inability to see their toxicity was his biggest blind spot. A blind spot they would soon exploit with surgical precision. The setup for my downfall began with an invitation to Sunday dinner. It was nothing out of the ordinary. These dinners happened once a month, a tradition Carol insisted upon. Just a quiet family meal. She'd chirped over the phone, "Robert is making his famous roast." Her tone was unusually sweet, a warning sign I should have heeded. For weeks leading up to it, Carol had been peppering me with odd questions. Questions about my work hours, my business trips, the new male colleague my company had just hired from a competitor. At the time, I brushed them off as her usual nosiness, her way of gathering data for some unspoken family ledger. Jessica, meanwhile, had started commenting on my social media posts with an unnerving frequency, leaving saccharine remarks like, "Living your best life, you're always so busy and adventurous." Looking back, it was all part of the performance, the careful arrangement of stage props before the curtain rose. They weren't just making conversation, they were building a narrative. They were gathering the threads they would later weave into a web of lies, and I, blissfully unaware, was handing them the spool. I walked into that house on Sunday evening with a bottle of wine and a smile, ready to play my part as the dutiful daughter-in-law, never suspecting that I was the lamb being led to a meticulously planned slaughter. The air in my in-laws' house was thick with the scent of roasted potatoes and a tension I couldn't quite name. Robert, my father-in-law, gave me a warm but fleeting hug, his eyes betraying a nervousness that was unusual for his typically placid demeanor. Ethan was already there, chatting with his dad about a new architectural project, Everything seemed normal, yet a low hum of anxiety vibrated just beneath the surface of the polite chatter. Carol and Jessica were a flurry of motion in the kitchen, their movements a little too sharp, their smiles a little too wide. We sat down at the large mahogany dining table, the same table that had witnessed decades of family history. Carol placed the roast in the center with a theatrical flourish. "Well, isn't this lovely?" she said, beaming at all of us, all my family together. "It's so important to cherish these moments of honesty and closeness." The word honesty hung in the air, heavy and loaded. The small talk during the meal was stilted. Ethan tried to fill the silence with work anecdotes, and Robert asked about our garden, but Carol and Jessica just picked at their food, exchanging loaded glances over my head. I felt like I was in a play where everyone but me had read the script. Finally, as dessert was being served, a store-bought cheesecake Jessica claimed as her own. Carol cleared her throat. The sound was like a gavel striking wood, calling the court to order. "Ethan, darling," she began, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "There's something we need to discuss, as a family." Ethan looked up, confused. "What is it, Mom?" Carol reached over and placed a hand on his arm, her expression a perfect mask of sorrow. "We are so worried about you, about your marriage." I froze, my fork hovering over my plate. This was it. The ambush I hadn't known was coming. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Jessica slid a manila folder onto the center of the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "We have some things we think you need to see, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Ethan stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Hesitantly, he opened it. Inside were a series of printed photographs. The first few were of me, grainy and taken from a distance, having lunch with a male colleague. It was a work meeting, completely innocent, but the framing made it look secretive. Another showed my car parked outside a hotel downtown on a day I had a conference there. "That's my work conference from last month," I stated, my heart starting to pound. Carol shook her head sadly. "Is it, dear? Because we have a witness who said you were there with a man." Then came the printed screenshots of text messages, allegedly from my phone. They were flirtatious, filled with innuendo and plans for secret meetups with a man whose name was blocked out. "These are fake," I said, my voice rising in disbelief. "I have never written these. This is insane." The messages were expertly crafted, using phrases I sometimes used, but twisting them into something ugly and illicit. They had studied me, my speech patterns, my schedule, everything. Ethan looked at the pages, his face pale and unreadable. He looked from the photos to me, his eyes filled with a flicker of doubt I had never seen before. It was a tiny crack in our foundation, but it was there. "There's more," Carol said, her voice cold and final. She accused me of draining our joint savings account, of having secret credit cards, of living a complete double life. Lie after lie, each one more elaborate and damaging than the last, all presented with the calm, chilling conviction of a prosecutor laying out an open and shut case. We didn't want to believe it. Jessica sniffled, dabbing at her dry eyes. "But we couldn't let you be made a fool of, Ethan. We love you too much." I looked at my husband, waiting for him to leap to my defense, to call out this ridiculous theatrical sham. But he just sat there, silent, staring at the fabricated evidence. In that moment, surrounded by my accusers, the silence from the one person who should have been my staunchest defender was the most profound betrayal of all. The smiles and whispers had finally given way to a full-blown assault, and they had hit their target perfectly. The car ride home was a tomb of silence, the space between Ethan and me, usually filled with easy conversation and shared music, felt vast and cold. I kept replaying the scene at the dinner table in my head, the smug certainty on Carol's face, the crocodile tears in Jessica's eyes, and the devastating, gut-wrenching doubt in Ethan's. He hadn't condemned me, but he hadn't defended me either. He had simply gathered the folder of lies and said, "We should go." Now the folder sat on the back seat, a toxic presence radiating deceit. When we got home, the silence broke, but not in the way I had hoped. It wasn't a rush of "I'm sorry, this is crazy, I believe you." Instead, it was a quiet, hesitant question. "Savannah," Ethan started, his voice strained, the text messages. "Some of them just sound like you and that hotel. You never told me your conference ran so late." It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't an affirmation of trust either. It was the sound of poison seeping into the roots of our marriage. I tried to explain, to reason, but my words felt hollow against the tangible proof he held in his hands. "Ethan, look at me. Do you really believe I would do this?" I pleaded. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted, and his words broke my heart. He said he needed some space and went into his home office, closing the door behind him. I was left alone in our living room, the heart of our home, feeling like a complete stranger. Sleep was impossible. My mind was a chaotic storm of anger, hurt, and disbelief. How could they do this? Why? I sank onto the sofa, pulling the folder toward me with trembling hands. I had to look at it again, away from their accusing eyes. I needed to understand how they had built this cage of lies around me. I spread the printed photos and screenshots across the coffee table, my own life twisted into a narrative of betrayal. The photos of my lunch meeting were taken with a long lens, clearly intended to look clandestine. The hotel photo was just my car in a parking garage. It was circumstantial nonsense, but it looked damning when packaged with the rest. Then I focused on the text messages. They were the cornerstone of their attack. The font was a standard one, the layout generic. They could have been created in any basic photo editing software. I read them over and over, my brain catching on the little details. They had my cadence, my use of emojis, but something was slightly off. There was a message that read, "Can't wait for our little getaway to the coast next month." I frowned. I hate the coast. I'm allergic to shellfish and I burn easily. Ethan knew this better than anyone. Why would I plan a romantic getaway to a place I actively disliked? It was a small detail, but a significant one. A forger can copy a signature, but they can't replicate the soul of the person writing it. Then I saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack in their otherwise perfect facade. On one of the screenshots, meant to be from my phone, the carrier name in the top left corner was misspelled. Instead of Verizon, it read Verison. It was a minuscule typo, the kind you'd make if you were hastily creating a fake graphic and not paying close attention to the tiny details on a real phone status bar. My heart leaped. An e-commerce manager lives and dies by details. I spend my days analyzing user interfaces, spotting pixel misalignments, and ensuring every single element on a web page is perfect. My eyes were trained to see exactly this kind of error. They had been so focused on the content of the lie that they'd made a mistake on the container. It was a small thing, but it was proof. It was objective, undeniable proof that this document was a fabrication. A wave of cold, clear fury washed over me, extinguishing the panic and despair. They thought they were clever, but they were sloppy. And they had severely underestimated the woman they were trying to destroy. The game was no longer about defending my innocence to my husband. It was about exposing the guilty. They had started a war, and now, armed with that one tiny spelling mistake, I was ready to fight back. The next morning, Ethan was still distant. He was civil, but a wall of uncertainty stood between us. He was a visual person, an architect who trusted blueprints and tangible plans. His mother and sister had handed him a blueprint for my infidelity, and despite his love for me, he couldn't completely ignore its detailed, albeit forged, specifications. I knew that simply pointing out the typo wouldn't be enough. I needed more than a crack in their facade. I needed to bring the entire wall crashing down, and to do that, I had to use my own professional toolkit. My world was data, analytics, and digital trails. It was time to turn those skills inward, to investigate the attack on my own life. I told Ethan I was working from home, which wasn't unusual. As soon as he left for his office, I turned our quiet home into an operational headquarters. My first target was the digital photograph of the text messages. I scanned the printout at the highest possible resolution. While the original file was gone, the printout still held clues. I zoomed in on the Verison typo, documenting it. But I needed more. I began analyzing the compression artifacts around the text. In my line of work, you learn to spot manipulated images. The text boxes had a slightly different image quality than the rest of the screenshot's user interface, suggesting they were layered on top of a template. It was amateur work, but convincing to the untrained eye. Next, I turned my attention to the source of the photos. The grainy, long, lens shots of me at lunch had to have been taken by someone who, Jessica's lifestyle blog, was my next stop. I scrolled through months of her posts. It was a sea of avocado toast, new outfits, and staged candid moments. I started a deep dive into the background of her photos, looking for clues, and then I found it. In a post from 3 weeks ago, captioned "Exploring the City's Hidden Gems," Jessica was posing in front of a fountain. In the reflection of a shop window behind her, barely visible but there if you knew to look, was a man holding a professional camera with a telephoto lens. Referenced the location. It was directly across the street from the cafe where I'd had my business lunch. She hadn't just been in the area, she had been there with a photographer, but who was he? I saved the image and ran a reverse image search on the photographer's face. It was a long shot, but it paid off. I got a hit on a local freelance photography website. His name was Leo. His portfolio was mostly cheap weddings and corporate headshots. He was a hired gun. This was getting bigger than I thought. How did Jessica, who was perpetually broke, afford a private investigator, even a low-budget one? This smelled like Carol's money and her real estate connections. The final piece was the narrative itself. The lies about my finances, the secret getaways, they were specific. It occurred to me that they must have had some access to my life to construct such detailed fabrications. I started with our home computer. Ethan and I shared it, and he wasn't particularly tech-savvy. I checked the browser history. In the weeks leading up to the dinner, there were dozens of searches. How to create fake text messages. Best photo editing software for beginners. How to track someone's location. These weren't my searches. I checked the login history on the computer. There were several logins at times when both Ethan and I were at work. Someone else had been in our house. My blood ran cold. I immediately thought of Jessica. We had given her a spare key months ago for emergencies. On a hunch, I logged into our Wi-Fi router's admin panel. Most people never check these logs, but they store a record of every device that connects. And there it was, Jessica's phone, Jessi's phone, had connected to our network on 3 separate afternoons in the past month, each time for about an hour. She had been in our house on our computer, researching how to frame me. This wasn't just a smear campaign, it was a premeditated, calculated invasion. She and Carol hadn't just told lies, they had committed a crime. They had trespassed both physically and digitally. The dots were connecting, forming a dark and twisted picture of jealousy, manipulation, and malice. I now had the router logs, the photographer, the doctored images, and their sloppy typo. It was more than enough. My plan was no longer just about defense. It was time to design a counter-attack. The evidence I had gathered was a potent cocktail of digital proof and cold, hard facts. It was everything I needed to not only clear my name, but to expose Carol and Jessica for the malicious conspirators they were. But simply showing it to Ethan wasn't enough. He was already caught in the middle, his loyalty torn. A private reveal would just lead to a messy family argument where Carol would inevitably twist the narrative, play the victim, and paint me as the hysterical, vindictive wife. No, this needed to be handled with the same theatrical precision they had used against me. They had chosen a dinner party for their stage, so I would set a stage of my own. My first step was to secure my home. I changed the Wi-Fi password and had the locks changed the very next day, citing a recent neighborhood break-in. I told the locksmith I needed it done urgently. When Jessica called that afternoon asking if I was home because she wanted to drop something off, I politely told her I was busy but would catch up with her soon. The lie was effortless. They had taught me their language. Next, I needed to approach Ethan. I couldn't keep him in the dark any longer, and I needed to know, once and for all, where he stood. That evening, I didn't confront him with anger. I approached him with the calm, methodical demeanor of my job. I laid out my evidence on the dining room table. The high-resolution scan of the texts with the Verison typo circled in red. The annotated screenshot from Jessica's blog showing the photographer, the printout of the Wi-Fi router logs. I didn't ask you to believe me before, Ethan. I said quietly, now I'm asking you to believe the data. He looked at each piece of evidence, his face shifting from confusion to shock and finally to a deep, sorrowful anger. The router logs were what broke him. The knowledge that his sister had been in our home, violating our privacy to build a web of lies, was a betrayal he couldn't ignore. I'm so sorry, Savannah, he whispered, his voice cracking. I should have known. I should have trusted you. The wall between us crumbled. He was hurt, ashamed of his doubt, but he was back on my side. He was my husband again. What do they want? He asked, bewildered. Why would they do this? I think I know. I said, my mind connecting the final dots, but I need to be sure. I told him my plan, not all of it, but enough. I told him I was going to arrange another family dinner. He was hesitant, worried it would just be another horrible confrontation. Trust me, I said, this time we're in control. We're not the guests of honor at an ambush. We're the hosts. We're setting our own table. My plan had several components. The first was a quiet conversation with Robert, my father-in. Law. I met him for coffee without anyone else knowing. I showed him a small part of the evidence, just enough to make him understand the gravity of the situation. As a retired teacher and a fundamentally decent man, he was horrified. He admitted Carol had been growing more and more obsessed with my independence and career, seeing it as a threat to her family's traditional values. He also confessed something crucial. Carol was in financial trouble. A few bad investments she'd kept secret had dwindled their retirement fund. She was desperate. Suddenly, her motivation became crystal clear. If I was out of the picture, declared an unfaithful spendthrift wife in a divorce, Ethan would be emotionally vulnerable and move back home. His income, which was substantial, could be funneled back into her control. It was a disgusting, predatory plan born of greed and desperation. With Robert's troubled conscience as a potential, if silent, ally and Ethan's unwavering support now secured, the final pieces of my plan fell into place. I called Carol. Using my most cheerful voice, I invited them all over for dinner the following Saturday. I think we all need to talk and clear the air, I said sweetly. Ethan and I have an announcement to make. Carol's voice on the other end was laced with smug victory. She thought I was coming to confess, to beg for forgiveness, to announce the end of my marriage. She readily accepted the invitation. She had no idea that she wasn't coming for an apology. She was coming to be served her just desserts. Saturday evening arrived, thick with anticipation. Our home, usually a haven of warmth and comfort, felt like a courtroom. Ethan and I moved with a quiet, synchronized purpose. He set the table with our best china while I put the finishing touches on dinner. On the surface, it was a picture of domestic harmony, but hidden in the study, connected to the large television in our living room, was my laptop, containing the presentation that would serve as the evening's main course. Carol and Jessica arrived first, their faces arranged in masks of solemn concern. They brought a sympathy card. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Robert followed, his expression grim. He knew this was no ordinary dinner, and he couldn't meet my eye. They settled in the living room, and I served drinks. The small talk was excruciating. Carol kept patting Ethan's hand, saying things like, "We're here for you, sweetie, whatever you decide." Jessica looked at me with a pity that was so fake it was almost comical. They were playing their roles to the hilt, confident in their victory. After a tense first course, I stood up, as I mentioned on the phone. I began, my voice clear and steady. Ethan and I have an announcement. But first, I want to thank you, Carol and Jessica, for your incredible concern for our marriage. You went to such great lengths to uncover what you believed was the truth, and I think it's important that we review your findings together. A flicker of confusion crossed Carol's face. This wasn't the tearful confession she had expected. With a small remote, I turned on the television. The first slide of my presentation appeared on the screen. It was a high-resolution image of the fake text messages with the Verison typo circled in bright red. "Let's start with the evidence," I said calmly. "Carol, as a former real estate agent, you know that details matter. It's a shame your PI wasn't as detail-oriented." I clicked to the next slide. It was the photo from Jessica's blog, with the reflection of the photographer zoomed in and enhanced. Beside it was his professional headshot from his website. "Jessica, for someone who claims to be a lifestyle blogger, you seem to have a knack for surveillance. Is this man a new collaborator, or was he just hired for a very specific project?" Jessica's face went white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Next, I displayed the Wi-Fi router logs. The dates and times of Jessi's phone, connecting to our network, were listed in a clear, undeniable table. "You must have missed us terribly to come over so often while we were at work," I said, looking directly at my sister-in-law. "You're welcome anytime, of course, but it's polite to call first." The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of my clicks advancing the slides. Ethan stood beside me, a silent, solid wall of support. I presented everything. The analysis of the photo compression, the browser history from our computer listing their search queries on how to fake evidence. Piece by piece, I dismantled their entire conspiracy with cold, hard facts. Carol's face had transformed from smug confidence to a mask of pure fury. Her trap had been sprung, but she was the one caught in it. "This is ridiculous. She's making this all up." She sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. Then came the finale. My voice softened. "I couldn't understand why you would do this. It seemed so cruel, but then I realized it wasn't about me at all. It was about money." I looked at Robert, whose face was etched with shame. Then I turned back to Carol. "You're in debt, Carol. Your investments went south, and you're running out of money. You told Robert you lost 20,000, but I did a little more digging. Public records are a powerful thing. My final slide was a screenshot of a recent property lien filed against their house for over $100,000 in unpaid business loans. You didn't just want to break up our marriage, I said, my voice ringing with clarity. You wanted to get your son back. You wanted his income to bail you out of the hole you dug for yourself. You were willing to destroy my life and his happiness to save yourself. The truth landed in the center of the room with devastating force. Jessica burst into tears, not of remorse, but of a child caught red-handed. Carol was speechless, her face a ghastly shade of pale. She looked at Ethan, her son, hoping for a lifeline, but Ethan just looked back at her with eyes full of profound disappointment and disgust. The announcement we have, Ethan said, his voice hard as steel, is that Savannah is my wife, this is our home, and you are no longer welcome in it. That was the true main course, not just the exposure of their lies, but the declaration of our unbreakable unity. The dinner party was over. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a profound silence descended upon the family. Carol and Jessica left our house without another word, their grand performance finally over, leaving only the ugly reality of their actions behind. Robert lingered for a moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry, Savannah," he said, his voice heavy with a shame that felt genuine. "I knew she was desperate, but I never imagined this. I should have been stronger." I simply nodded. There was nothing else to say. He was a casualty of his own inaction, a man who had chosen peace over integrity for far too long. He left, and the door closed on a chapter of our lives. The days that followed were quiet and strange. It felt like the calm after a devastating storm. Ethan and I talked for hours, more openly and honestly than ever before. He expressed his shame and regret for his moment of doubt, and I understood that he had been a victim too, manipulated by the two people he was raised to trust unconditionally. The experience, as horrific as it was, had forged our bond into something stronger. We had faced the worst and had chosen each other, unequivocally. We were a team. The fallout in the wider family was swift. Robert, finally shaken from his passivity, confronted Carol. We weren't privy to the details, but we heard through the grapevine that he gave her an ultimatum: get therapy and professional financial help, or he would leave. Faced with losing everything, she reluctantly agreed. Her power over the family was broken. Jessica, stripped of her mother's support and exposed as a petty co-conspirator, retreated into silence. Her lifestyle blog went dark. There were no more artfully arranged photos, no more hollow inspirational quotes. Reality, it seemed, was a bitter pill to swallow. We received no apologies. I didn't expect any. People like Carol and Jessica don't apologize. They just lament being caught. Their silence was its own confession. Ethan made it clear to them both that any future relationship would be on his and Savannah's terms, and would only be possible after a long period of them taking accountability for their actions. He set a firm boundary, protecting our new, peaceful existence from their toxicity. For me, the victory wasn't just in the exposure of their lies. It was in the rediscovery of my own strength. They had tried to paint me as a weak, deceitful woman, but their attack had only revealed my resilience. My career, which they had tried to use as a weapon against me, was actually what saved me. My attention to detail, my ability to analyze data, my understanding of the digital world. These were the skills that had allowed me to uncover the truth and fight back. I had not only defended my honor, but I had also validated my own capabilities in a deeply personal way. A few months later, Ethan and I took a trip, just the two of us. We went to the mountains, a place of clean air and expansive views. Standing on a peak, looking out at the endless horizon, I felt a sense of profound peace. The drama, the betrayal, the anger, it all felt so small and distant. We had weathered the storm. We had rebuilt our foundation on a bedrock of absolute trust, forged in the fire of deceit. My in-laws had tried to author the end of my story, but they had failed. Instead, they had inadvertently handed me the pen, allowing me to write a new, much better chapter. A chapter about strength, truth, and a future I would define on my own terms. It was a new beginning.